Black CEO's daughter goes undercover as a cleaner to test the employees, the reckoning that shook an empire. Jasmine Williams had everything: a Harvard degree, a Forbes 30 Under 30 title, and a clear path to success as the heir to Williams Innovations, the multi-billion-dollar company founded by her father, Robert Williams. But what she didn't have was a true understanding of how the company functioned beyond the boardroom. When Robert suffered a near-fatal heart attack, the question of succession became urgent. But before he handed over the reins, he needed his daughter to understand the company from the ground up. Not from reports, not from executive meetings, but from the trenches. That's how Jasmine found herself swapping designer suits for a cleaner's uniform, trading power for invisibility. What she discovered in those 2 weeks shattered her perception of the company she was about to inherit. This was more than a leadership test. It was a revelation. Jasmine Williams had spent her entire life preparing to take over Williams Innovations, the multi-billion-dollar company her father, Robert Williams, had built from nothing. She was a Harvard graduate, a Forbes 30 Under 30 honoree, and an executive vice president whose name carried weight in boardrooms worldwide. But despite all her achievements, her father still wasn't convinced she was ready. The moment that changed everything came over dinner at their modernist home overlooking the city. Robert, usually a force of energy and control, looked weary, his once vibrant presence dimmed by the health scare that had nearly taken his life 6 months ago. Jasmine had noticed the difference. The lines on his face were deeper, and the weight of his legacy seemed heavier than ever. "You've done well, Jasmine," he said, his deep voice still carrying its familiar authority. "But there's something you don't know." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Robert leaned forward, his silver-streaked hair catching the light. "You know how to run this company from the top, but you don't know what it's like at the bottom." She straightened, feeling a flicker of defensiveness. "Dad, I've been in this business for years. I know every department, every process." He shook his head. "You know numbers, you know reports, but reports don't tell you about culture. They don't show you how people actually experience this company." He sighed, pushing his plate aside. "I keep hearing whispers that Williams Innovations isn't what it used to be, that we've lost our values. But you know how it is, people behave differently when the boss is around. They tell us what we want to hear." Jasmine remained silent, sensing where this was going. "I built this company on integrity, but I don't know if it still stands for that, and neither do you." Jasmine frowned. "So, what are you suggesting?" Robert's eyes locked onto hers, full of unspoken challenges. "I'm suggesting that before you take over, you see this company for what it really is, from the ground up." Jasmine's heart pounded. He couldn't mean, "I want you to work as a cleaner, disguised, no special treatment, no shortcuts. 2 weeks. See what happens." Jasmine opened her mouth to protest. This was ridiculous. But then she stopped. Because deep down, she knew he was right. She had grown up privileged, trained to lead at the highest levels, but she had never seen the company through the eyes of those who weren't born into power. She took a breath, her mind already racing. "Fine," she said. 2 weeks." Robert nodded, a rare flicker of satisfaction in his tired eyes. "Then you'll be ready." Jasmine spent the next few days erasing herself. Her designer wardrobe was swapped for cheap, practical clothing. Her long, straightened hair was allowed to return to its natural curls, which she then covered with a simple headscarf. Her manicured nails? Gone. Her signature makeup? Stripped away. She replaced her designer glasses with plain frames, ones that wouldn't attract attention. Even her name changed. Jasmine Williams no longer existed. In her place stood Janet, an unremarkable cleaner hired through a third-party company. Her background records were fabricated with just enough detail to pass any HR screening. Her employee file listed her as a new hire on the night cleaning crew. As far as Williams Innovations was concerned, Janet was nobody. At 9:45 p.m., Jasmine walked into the employee entrance, her heart pounding harder than it ever had in a boardroom. Everything was different. No sleek black cars pulling up to the valet, no respectful nods from security. Just fluorescent lights, the scent of industrial cleaner, and a world she had never noticed before. She was met by her new supervisor, a wiry man named Rick, who looked at her like she was already a problem. "You're the new girl?" "Yes, sir," she said, keeping her voice neutral. He shoved a ring of keys into her hands. "We don't do sir here, just do your job. If I have to come looking for you, you're fired." Jasmine nodded. And just like that, her new life began. Jasmine had expected to be ignored. She had not expected to be treated as if she were invisible. She learned fast. Executives didn't acknowledge cleaning staff, they walked past them as if they weren't there. If an executive was still working, you had to silently work around them. No eye contact, no distractions. If something went wrong, it was your fault, always. Her first task was to mop the executive floor, a place she had walked hundreds of times as a VP. Only this time, no one looked at her. She passed Derek Phillips, the head of marketing, a man she had once sat in meetings with. Ere he'd even glance up. It was like she had ceased to exist. She had just finished cleaning a hallway when she felt eyes on her. Turning, she saw Gerald Hayes, the operations manager, watching her with thinly veiled disgust. "You call this clean?" he sneered. Jasmine froze. The floor was spotless. "I just finished this area, sir." His eyes narrowed. Then, without warning, he took a full cup of water and poured it directly onto the floor. Jasmine gasped as cold liquid splashed onto her shoes, soaking through her uniform. Gerald smirked. "Now you have something real to clean up." And with that he walked away, leaving wet footprints behind. Jasmine stood there, her hands shaking with a mix of rage and humiliation. She had spent her whole life commanding respect, and now, in this moment, she was nothing. But as she knelt to mop up the water, a new thought formed. This isn't about me, this is about all of them. Her father had wanted her to understand the company from the ground up. And now she did. Because from the ground up this company was rotten, and she was about to tear it all down. Jasmine had always believed that Williams Innovations was built on respect, integrity, and innovation. That belief shattered within her first 48 hours as a cleaner. Her father's company, the empire he had built from nothing, was not the place she thought it was. And the worst part? No one seemed to care. The cleaning crew at Williams Innovations wasn't a team, it was a system of survival. People didn't talk, people didn't complain. They just did their jobs and tried to avoid trouble. Jasmine had expected indifference from the executives. But what she hadn't expected was the fear. On her third night, she noticed something strange. Darnell, an older janitor, was scrubbing the same spot on the floor for the third time. She leaned in. "Darnell, you already cleaned that area?" His eyes flicked up in panic and he shook his head frantically. "Shh! Gerald's coming." Jasmine stiffened. Gerald Hayes? The man who had poured water on her just days ago. The moment Gerald stepped onto the executive floor, the entire atmosphere shifted. People moved faster, tensed up. Jasmine clenched her jaw, pretending to focus on mopping, but she was watching everything. Gerald didn't just manage the cleaning crew, he ruled them with fear. And nobody dared to challenge him. Until now. That night, Jasmine had been assigned to clean the third-floor hallway, the same one where Gerald had humiliated her days earlier. She worked in silence, moving efficiently. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Gerald's expensive dress shoes clicking against the floor. She kept her head down. She could feel him watching her. Missed a spot. Jasmine gritted her teeth. "I'll take care of it, sir." "You better." She didn't look up. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. But as Gerald turned to walk away, she caught something new, a flicker of frustration on his face. He wanted her to break, to react, to submit. And when she didn't, it bothered him. Jasmine bit back a smirk. This was a game to him. But he had no idea who he was playing against. If Gerald was the tyrant, then Derek Phillips was the puppet master. The head of marketing and branding, Derek was a man who thrived on control. And his favorite pastime? Making life miserable for the people beneath him. On her fifth night, Jasmine was assigned to clean his office. She entered the room, expecting the usual routine. But Derek was still inside, leaning back in his oversized leather chair, sipping coffee as he stared at his computer screen. He didn't even glance at her. "You're late," he said. Jasmine blinked. She was right on schedule. But she knew better than to argue. "I'll get started, sir." She worked quickly and efficiently, making sure to dust every surface. As she reached for the glass coffee table, Derek scoffed. "You're doing it wrong." Jasmine paused. "Excuse me, sir?" Derek finally turned to her, eyes filled with bored cruelty. "You don't clean glass in straight lines. Circular motions. Try again." Jasmine bit back a sigh. She cleaned the glass again. Then he pointed to the bookshelf. "Still dusty. Do it again." In the window, then the desk. Each time he found a new excuse. Each time she re-cleaned an already spotless area. And when she finally finished, he leaned back and smirked. "Not bad, maybe you'll get it right next time." She walked out without a word. Her hands were shaking with rage. This wasn't about cleanliness. This was about power. That was when Jasmine realized something. Gerald and Derek weren't the disease. They were just symptoms. The real problem was the company itself. It was the silence. The HR department had to know what was happening. They just didn't care. And Jasmine was about to prove it. The next morning, she did something no cleaner had ever dared to do. She walked into HR's office. The department head, Karen Mitchell, gave her a polite but distant smile. "How can I help you?" Jasmine hesitated for half a second, then spoke carefully. "I wanted to report something about Mr. Hayes." Karen's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes shifted. "Oh, what about him?" Jasmine kept her voice steady. "He poured water on me, in front of others, humiliated me." Karen let out a small sigh and folded her hands. "I see. And how do you feel about that?" Jasmine stared at her. How did she feel? "I feel like I was disrespected, and I think if he did it to me, he's done it to others." Karen gave her a sympathetic tilt of the head. Then she leaned in. "Listen, dear, you're new here. You have to understand how things work. Some managers, well, they have high expectations. It's nothing personal." Jasmine's stomach turned. "So nothing will be done." Karen gave a small shrug. "I'll have a talk with him. But I suggest you focus on doing your job. These things tend to work themselves out." Jasmine stood slowly, her hands tight at her sides. She thanked Karen, then walked out. The moment she was out of sight, she pulled out her phone. Because she had recorded every word. And when this was over, that recording would burn Karen Mitchell's career to the ground. By the end of her first week, Jasmine had uncovered Gerald's abuse of power, Derek's cruelty, HR's corruption. And now, she was done playing their game. She wasn't just going to expose them. She was going to destroy them. Because she wasn't just a cleaner. She was Jasmine Williams. And she was about to take her company back. Jasmine had seen enough. She had spent her first week as a cleaner witnessing the systematic cruelty, arrogance, and indifference that had infected Williams' innovations. She had endured Gerald's abuse, Derek's manipulations, and Karen's corruption in HR. But what happened on Thursday night of her second week would be the moment everything changed. Because that was the night Gerald went too far. And it was also the night Jasmine decided to end him. By now, Jasmine had collected enough evidence to build a case against the toxic leadership at Williams Innovations. She had recordings, security footage, and witness testimonies from employees too afraid to speak up. She had seen the patterns of abuse, the psychological games, and the way people were broken into submission. But she needed one last piece of irrefutable proof. One final moment of Gerald exposing himself for who he really was. and she knew exactly how to get it. She waited, and Gerald didn't disappoint. It was 11:30 p.m. when Jasmine found herself alone in the executive hallway, finishing up her last task for the night. Most of the offices were dark and empty, except for a few late-night workers burning the midnight oil. Jasmine pushed her cleaning cart forward, her heart pounding, because she knew what was coming, and she was ready for it. The moment she heard Gerald's footsteps approaching, she stopped cleaning and pretended to adjust her mop. She didn't need to turn around. She could already feel his presence behind her. "You again?" Gerald's voice came from over her shoulder. His tone was dripping with condescension, as if her mere existence offended him. Jasmine kept her expression neutral, gripping the mop tightly. "Just finishing up, sir." "Sir?" Gerald laughed coldly. "You think a simple sir makes up for your incompetence? You people always think respect is just a word you can throw around when you need something." Jasmine's stomach turned at the way he said "you people." Her pulse spiked. This was it. She kept her head down, her voice controlled. "I apologize if my work isn't up to your standards. I'll make sure to—" Before she could finish, it happened. Gerald reached for a full cup of water on a nearby table. And then, without a second of hesitation, he dumped it directly over her head. The cold liquid hit her scalp first, running down her face, dripping past her collar, soaking her uniform. Her entire body stiffened from the shock. The hallway fell silent. "And Gerald?" He smiled. "Now you have something real to clean up," he said casually, dropping the empty cup onto the floor beside her. Jasmine didn't move, didn't breathe, because this wasn't just humiliation anymore. This was pure, calculated cruelty. This was a man who enjoyed his power too much, and this was the exact moment Jasmine knew he would never see what was coming for him. For a split second, Jasmine's instincts screamed at her to stand up and reveal who she really was. To tell him that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. But instead she did something even more powerful. She knelt down, and she cleaned up the water. Not because she was submissive, not because she was afraid, but because every second she spent on that floor was a second closer to his downfall. She wasn't cleaning. She was waiting. Waiting for the perfect moment to destroy him. By the time Jasmine clocked out that night, her mind was no longer clouded with emotion. She was calm, she was focused, and she was dangerous. Because Gerald had just given her everything she needed. The security cameras in the hallway had caught the entire thing. The microphone she had hidden on herself had recorded every word. She had undeniable proof of Gerald's harassment and abuse, his racist undertones, his complete disregard for human dignity. And that meant his career was over. But as Jasmine began piecing together her evidence, she discovered something even worse. Something that went beyond abuse. She started digging deeper into financial records, payroll reports, and internal emails she had managed to access. And that's when she found the smoking gun. Gerald wasn't just a tyrant, he was a thief. Along with Derek Phillips and Karen Mitchell, Gerald had been secretly diverting company funds meant for lower-pay employees into their own pockets. They were embezzling money from the very people they were mistreating. And they weren't working alone. They were also leaking company information to a competitor, trying to sabotage Williams' innovations from the inside. Their goal? To push Robert Williams out before succession happened so they could take full control of the company. Jasmine sat back in shock, staring at the evidence she had collected. What had started as a mission to expose workplace abuse had turned into a full-blown corporate takedown. And now she had two choices. She could go to her father quietly, present the evidence, and have these people removed. Or she could make an example out of them. She could burn their reputations to the ground in front of the entire company. She closed her laptop. She had made her choice. The next morning, Jasmine sat across from her father at the family estate. She took a deep breath. "Dad, I have something to show you." For the next 3 hours she presented everything, the videos, the audio, the financial records, the proof of corruption, abuse, and corporate sabotage. Robert listened silently, his expression growing darker with every revelation. But when he saw Gerald dump the water on her, something changed. His fist clenched, his jaw tightened, and for the first time in Jasmine's life she saw real anger in her father's eyes. "They betrayed everything this company stands for," he said quietly, "and they think they're untouchable." Jasmine met his gaze. "Not anymore." Her father nodded. "What's the plan?" Jasmine exhaled. "We take them down, publicly, no warnings, no mercy." A slow smile spread across Robert's face. "Then let's give them the reckoning they deserve." Jasmine had waited 2 weeks for this moment. 2 weeks of humiliation, of watching injustice unfold, of seeing people crushed under the weight of arrogance and cruelty. But now it was their turn. The plan had been set in motion. An emergency board meeting had been called for Monday morning at 10 a.m., with every executive required to attend. Gerald, Derek, Karen, Veronica, all of them would be there, completely unaware that their entire world was about to come crashing down. By the time they walked out of that boardroom, their careers would be over. And Jasmine? She would finally take her place as the true leader of Williams Innovations. Jasmine arrived at 7:30 a.m., still dressed in her cleaner's uniform. For the last time, she pushed her cart of supplies onto the executive floor. This time, there was no nervousness, no uncertainty. She moved with purpose. Because this wasn't a job anymore. This was a performance. She had deliberately scheduled herself to clean the boardroom before the meeting, ensuring she would be in the room when it all unfolded. As she wiped down the conference table, the door swung open. Gerald. He walked in, dressed in his usual tailored suit, holding a cup of coffee. He barely acknowledged her presence as he set down his briefcase. Then he turned, eyes narrowing. "You again," he muttered, shaking his head. Jasmine kept her back to him, pretending to focus on polishing the table. "Make sure this room is spotless. The CEO and the board will be here soon, and if I find one thing out of place, you're out." Jasmine turned just enough to meet his eyes, her expression neutral. "Understood, sir." She saw the small flicker of frustration in his face. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't reacting. And that bothered him. Good. Because in less than an hour he'd be begging for his job. By 9:45 a.m. executives and board members had begun gathering outside the boardroom, murmuring among themselves. The mood was tense. No one knew why the meeting had been called. Jasmine continued cleaning, blending into the background, listening to their casual arrogance as they sipped coffee and checked their phones. Then, at 9:55 a.m., Robert Williams arrived. He walked in, calm and composed, acknowledging the room with a brief nod. But Jasmine saw it. The hardness in his eyes. The rage beneath the surface. He wasn't here for a meeting. He was here for a reckoning. At exactly 10 a.m., he spoke. "Take your seats." The room fell silent. One by one the executives settled in, their expressions shifting to mild concern. Jasmine remained in the room, still playing her role, dusting the edges of the windows, pretending not to listen. Then Gerald's voice cut through the air. "Can we get rid of the cleaning staff? This is a private company business." A few chuckled. Jasmine paused, gripping the cloth in her hands. This was it. She turned, slowly, and met his eyes. Then she smiled. "Actually," she said calmly, interrupting him for the first time, "I think I'll stay." The room shifted. Eyes narrowed in confusion. Robert folded his hands on the table, his expression neutral. Gerald scoffed, clearly irritated. "And why the hell would we let a damn janitor stay in an executive meeting?" Jasmine tilted her head. Then, in one fluid motion, she reached up and removed her headscarf, letting her curls fall freely. Next, she took off her plain glasses and replaced them with her signature designer frames. And finally, she unzipped the cleaner's uniform, revealing the professionally tailored blazer and blouse underneath. The room frozen. Mouths fell open, and Gerald Hayes turned pale. because at that moment it all clicked. The cleaner they had abused, humiliated, and ignored was none other than Jasmine Williams, the next CEO of Williams Innovation. The silence was thick. Jasmine took a step forward, placing a small remote on the table. "You want to talk about company business, Gerald?" she said smoothly. She clicked the remote. A large screen lit up behind her. And then, the security footage played. The entire boardroom watched as Gerald's own face appeared on the screen, pouring water over her head, humiliating her. Derek forces her to clean the same areas repeatedly. Karen dismissed her complaints in HR. Veronica slaps her in front of employees. It was all there. Undeniable. Unforgivable. As the footage played, the executives and board members shifted uncomfortably. Some looked horrified. Others looked furious. But the ones at the center of it? They looked trapped. When the video ended, Jasmine turned to face them. "Would anyone like to explain why this is happening in our company?" Silence. Gerald stood abruptly, his face red with panic. This is taken out of context." Jasmine clicked the remote again. Another angle played. Another recording. Gerald watched himself, clearly, unmistakably, pouring water over her head. He swallowed hard. Derek looked like he was going to faint. Karen clutched her notepad, her face drained of color. Veronica sat still, jaw clenched. Then, finally, Robert Williams spoke. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice cold, dangerous. "Gerald Hayes, Derek Phillips, Karen Mitchell, and Veronica Wells are terminated from Williams Innovations for gross misconduct." Gerald's mouth opened and closed like a fish. You can't do this," he sputtered. Robert leaned back. "I just did." The door opened. 2 security officers stepped inside. "You will surrender your company credentials and be escorted off the premises," Robert continued. Karen let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. Derek stared at the floor, refusing to make eye contact. Veronica grabbed her purse and stood, refusing to show weakness. But Gerald lost it. "You can't do this to me," he roared. Security stepped forward. "Get your hands off me," he shouted, thrashing as they grabbed his arms. Jasmine watched calmly, and when Gerald's eyes met hers, she smiled. "Looks like you finally have something real to clean up," she said smoothly. The moment Gerald was dragged from the room, the tension broke. The board members turned to Jasmine, and Robert stood beside her. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder, "meet your new CEO." For the first time in decades, Williams Innovations was no longer being run by corrupt executives who wielded power as a weapon. The 4 disgraced leaders, Gerald, Derek, Karen, and Veronica, had been removed, and the entire company had witnessed their humiliating downfall. But Jasmine knew that firing them wasn't enough. The real work was just beginning. Because a company's culture doesn't change overnight. It had to be rebuilt piece by piece. And that was her next mission. The morning after the boardroom bloodbath, Jasmine arrived at Williams Innovations headquarters at 6:30 a.m. Not as Janet the cleaner, not as Robert's daughter, but as the CEO. She took the private elevator to the executive floor, the same floor she had been mopping just days ago, and stepped into the corner office that had once belonged to her father. But she didn't sit behind the desk. She didn't even look at the luxurious leather chair waiting for her. Instead, she stood by the window, staring out over the city. She had dreamed of this moment for years. But now that it was here, she felt the weight of it, the responsibility, the expectation. Her father had built this empire from nothing. Now it was up to her to save it. She turned away from the window, grabbed her notepad, and wrote down the 3 things she needed to do first. Overhaul the leadership team, repair the company's reputation, ensure that every employee at every level is valued and respected. She underlined the last point twice. Then she picked up the phone. It was time to get to work. By 8 a.m., Jasmine had gathered the remaining executives and department heads for a follow-up meeting. Many of them were still shaken by what had happened the day before. Some looked relieved. Others looked nervous, as if they were wondering if they were next. Good. She took her place at the head of the table, where her father had once sat, and looked each of them in the eye. "Let's be clear about what happened yesterday," she began, her voice calm but firm. "We didn't just fire 4 executives. We exposed a culture of abuse, corruption, and incompetence that was allowed to thrive under your leadership." The room was dead silent. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Some of you knew what was happening," she continued, "and you stayed silent." Someone cleared their throat. "Some of you participated." A few people lowered their eyes. "And some of you tried to do the right thing, but you didn't have the power to change it." She let that hang in the air. "That changes today." She paused, then pressed a button on the conference table. A screen lit up behind her, displaying a list of names. Not just the 4 who had been fired, but everyone who had enabled them. "These are the people who were complicit in what happened here," she said. "Some of them actively participated, others turned a blind eye. Either way, they have no place in the new Williams innovations." A few gasps echoed around the room, because Jasmine wasn't just cleaning the house. She was burning it down. Effective immediately, every person on this list is being terminated or placed under investigation. She turned to the head of legal and compliance. "Send HR their severance packages, lock them out of the system, have security, escort them out by noon." A few executives exchanged uneasy glances. But no one argued, because no one wanted to be next. Jasmine let that moment sink in. Then she moved on. "For those of you who remain, we have work to do." And just like that, the old Williams Innovations was officially dead. After the mass firings, Jasmine had 2 major goals: win back the trust of the employees, set a new standard for leadership. And she wasn't going to do that from behind a desk. Instead, she spent the next 2 weeks personally meeting with employees at every level. She walked through every department, introducing herself, not as CEO, but as someone who wanted to listen. She sat down with janitors, warehouse workers, IT technicians, receptionists, interns, engineers, customer service reps, the people who had been ignored for years. And she asked them one simple question: what would make this company better? At first, people were hesitant. They had spent years being silenced. But when they saw that she actually cared, the floodgates opened. They told her about low wages, unfair treatment, toxic managers, unrealistic expectations, and burnout. She wrote down every word. And then, she did something about it. Mandatory leadership training for all managers. An anonymous reporting system for workplace abuse. A restructuring of salaries, with raises for underpaid employees. Flexible work schedules to improve work-life balance. And most importantly, a new policy. Every employee, regardless of title, deserves to be treated with respect. Any manager who fails to uphold this standard will be held accountable. Period. Jasmine knew that the public had seen what happened. The downfall of Gerald, Derek, Karen, and Veronica had gone viral. The company's stock had dropped. Clients were hesitant. Investors were nervous. She had to restore their trust. So she did something no CEO had ever done before. She publicly acknowledged the failures. In a live-streamed company address, she stood on stage alone and said, "Williams Innovations failed its employees. We allowed a toxic culture to grow, and we didn't stop it. That ends now." She outlined everything: the firings, the reforms, the new policies. She promised transparency. And then she let the employees speak. Real workers, real stories. The people who had been silenced now had a voice. And just like that, trust was rebuilt. The media ran with it. A new era for Williams Innovations. The CEO who cleaned up her own company, literally. How Jasmine Williams destroyed toxic leadership overnight. The stock soared. Clients returned, investors had faith again, and for the first time in years, Williams Innovations was finally living up to its name. One evening months later, Jasmine sat in her office when her father walked in. He looked around, nodding in approval. "You did it," he said. Jasmine smiled. "I learned from the best." Robert chuckled. "No," he corrected. "You learned from experience." She thought back to those nights as a cleaner, to the humiliation, to the rage, to the fight for justice. And she knew he was right, because everything she had learned about real leadership, she hadn't learned it in a Harvard classroom. She had learned it on her hands and knees, mopping floors. And she would never forget that. Ever.